Janam Jamunatiram Vanachari Jamunatiram Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Jamunatiram Vanachari Jamunatiram Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridhari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Jamunatiram Vanachari Jamunatiram Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridhari Gaura Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayet Nasta Praeshva Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Naishtiki. Reading this morning from Srimad Bhagavatam, 11th Canto, Chapter 2, Text 13. Tvaya Paramakalyanam. Oops. Next one, I beg your pardon. Did we miss a verse? Oh, okay, beg your pardon. Sorry. Well, there goes that class. Just kidding. Atrapyudharantam timan itihasam puratanam arshabhanam cha samvadam videhasya mahatmanaha atrapyudharantam timam itihasam puratanam arshabhanam cha samvadam vidihasya mahatmanaha. Please chant. Itihasam chivasanam arshabhanam vidihasya mahatmanaha Sahasyanimam Samparatanaha Asabanam Padam Manaha Achadikahatimam Atanaham Asam Mahatmanaha. Anyone else like to chant? Abhyadharanam timam itihasam puratanam Chamadam itihasam mahatmanaha atrapyudharanti mam itihasam puratanam arshabhanam cha samvadam videhasya mahatmanaha. Okay, atrapapi. In this very matter of describing Bhagavad Dharma, udaharanti is given as an example. Imam, this, itihasam, historical account, puratanam, ancient, arshabhanam, of the sons of Rishabha, cha, and samvadam, the conversation, videhasya, with Janaka, king of Videha, Mahatmanaha, who was a great broad-minded soul. Translation. To explain the devotional service of the Lord, sages have related the ancient history of the conversation between the great soul King Videha and the sons of Rishabha. So this begins the section, the conversation between the 9 Yogendras and King Videha. But before we go to that, I just want to clarify, was I mistaken in understanding yesterday's verse was 12? Gotcha. We're doing 13 and 14. Okay, thank you. All right. So I'm going to go on with the text and purport for 13 first. Okay? And I'll just read the English. So this again is a conversation between Narada Muni and Vasudeva, the father of Lord Krishna. And so Vasudeva has asked some very pertinent questions, to which Narada replies in text 13. Today you have made me remember my Lord, the supremely blissful personality of Godhead, Narayana. The Supreme Lord is so auspicious that whoever hears and chants about him becomes completely pious. Purport. Srila Jiva Goswami has stated, Narayanas tadrisha dharme madhya guru rupa Narayanarshi. The word Narayana in this verse refers to the incarnation of Godhead, Narayana Rishi, who acted as Narada's spiritual master in this dharma. Srila Jiva Goswami has also pointed out, Smarita iti Krishno pasana veshana tasyapi vishramranat. The word Smarita, he who is brought back to memory, indicates that because of Narada's absorption in the worship of Krishna, he has forgotten Lord Naranarayan. In other words, if intense engagement in devotional service makes one sometimes forget the personality of Godhead, by Krishna's arrangement, such a sincere servitor will again be reminded of the personality of Godhead. A very nice point, huh? So that this verse, the subsequent verse, then goes on to explain the history of Srimad Bhagavatam as an authorized source for Krishna Smaranam, topics about Krishna to be remembered by the devotees. It is this verse, however, 13, that particularly caught my attention, and I'd like to know if we can focus on that. That will be all right. This is a very unusual statement from Narada Muni. Thank you for asking these questions. You've made me remember Krishna. Of course, Narada is one of the Mahajans. How could he forget Krishna? And yet he's saying that you have made me remember. And I appreciate that. Because remembering Krishna is supremely blissful. In the purport, the disciples of Srila Prabhupada are commenting that sometimes when one is very busy in Krishna service, one may not be thinking of Krishna. And so if the devotee comes and reminds us of Krishna, that's a blessing. That really is the business of every Vaishnava, isn't it? To remind others of Krishna. That's why we wear tilak and the sika, so we will remind them of Krishna coming or going. And the dichotomy between serving Krishna and remembering Krishna is very interesting in this verse. Once a devotee asked Jayananda Prabhu, how can I make spiritual advancement? And Jayananda replied, I don't know, I'm too busy to think about it. So is it different to be serving Krishna and to be remembering Krishna? Well, a devotee asked Srila Prabhupada this question once, and he replied that you cannot serve somebody without loving them. In other words, if we are serving Krishna, we are connected with Krishna automatically. And even if we're not feeling love for Krishna, or we're not thinking of Krishna, we're in the safe position, because that service is being prompted by remembrance and love. However, if we can think of Krishna while serving him, that's even a higher stage. That is multitasking, doing multiple forms of bhakti at the same time. Just like Mother Yashoda was feeding Krishna and cooking for Krishna, and as she was doing these loving duties, she would also sing about Krishna's pastimes in songs that had been written extemporaneously, just seeing the amazing things that her son was doing. So if we can do these multiple forms of service, that's advanced. But if we're at least doing one, then that's safe. As Srila Prabhupada said about kirtan, kirtan is the safest position in the material world. Because even if the roof collapses, not that it ever would, but if there was some catastrophic event, if we're engaged in kirtan, we are immediately going on to the spiritual world, because that's the business in the spiritual world. Everyone is collectively glorifying Krishna. So nonetheless, it's very interesting to see how Narada is saying this. Thank you for asking these pertinent questions. You've reminded me of Krishna. So to engage in service while remembering Krishna is the very instruction that Krishna gave Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. Go ahead and fight, But while you're fighting, think of me. Mam anusmara yudhyacha. Think of me while fighting. Think of me in my form as Krishna while you're fighting. That is the difference between Arjuna's consciousness at the beginning of Bhagavad Gita and at the end. At the beginning he was thinking he was just going to fight and questioning the value of such a fight. What is the use? I wouldn't even enjoy this kingdom even if I won it, if all my loved ones are dead. But by the end, he's ready. Yes, I'm ready to fight because this is your desire. Now I see this is my service to you. Remember in chapter 11 of the Gita, Krishna showed Arjuna that all these people were already dead. Bhishma, Drona, Karna, Jayadratha, they're already dead by my arrangement. Whether you do anything or not, they're already dead. So you have two choices. You can fight and claim your right to rule the kingdom, or you can quit and do nothing. It's not going to change the outcome. But if you fight, you'll be my tool. And if you are my tool, then you will be able to act in transcendental consciousness. And because you're acting in transcendental consciousness, you will be able to remember me. I'm doing this for Krishna. And so as Prabhupada said, you can't do something for someone unless there's love. Just like a mother with her child. The mother is constantly engaged in doing things for the child. 24/7, yeah? Any moment, any time of the day or night, the mother is ready to respond to the child's needs. This is love. Prabhupada called that the closest thing to love of God that can be found in the material world. 24/7, the mother is thinking about the child's welfare. And human children are so dependent. For the first year, for the first few weeks, they can't even get their head off the mat. And then for the first year, they can't walk and can't communicate their needs for another year, virtually. So very dependent. And this naturally invokes this loving care from the mother. Of course, there's a reason for this human distinction. The human being has the intelligence to understand the nature of birth and death in this world. We recently had a cow at our little family farm in Florida. A little calf was born, and calf was born at 8 p.m. and by 11 p.m. she was standing up and nursing and already sort of independent. So the point is that thinking of Krishna while we're serving him is a symptom of mature devotional service. In time, we will remember Krishna constantly. And also, when others talk about Krishna or bring up subjects about Krishna, as Vasudeva has done, then we automatically think of Krishna, and we're very, very grateful. So, as we were reading in the previous purport, there are many subjects for hearing and discussing in human society. This is the first verse of the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Many, many topics that could be discussed, but King Parikshit, Sukadeva Goswami is saying, you're very glorious because you're asking questions about Krishna. And these topics are worthy of discussion because they cause one to progress in life. Ayur harati vaipum sam udyan yaschanchayanasa. That with every rising and setting of the sun, for the non-devotee, they're going one day closer to death. But for those who read Srimad Bhagavatam and think of Krishna, they're getting one day closer to Krishna. So that the same daylight passing is bringing us progressively closer to a worthwhile goal, which is the very definition of happiness. Happiness is a progressive realization of a worthwhile goal. So our worthwhile goal in Krishna consciousness is to remember Krishna, to think of Krishna, to love Krishna like a mother loves her child, 24/7, always thinking, how can I serve my Lord? Now, in the application of Krishna consciousness, we have this wonderful task, just as Krishna gave Arjuna the opportunity to be the instrument of relieving the earth of her burden from all of these excessive military phalanxes. So Lord Chaitanya has left us with this burden of delivering the Western countries in particular. Paschatya Deshatarni. In fact, all the countries outside of Srila Prabhupada writes in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that Lord Chaitanya, when Lord Chaitanya appeared, he delivered all of India. And he kindly left the rest of the world for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Just so we have something to do. Now, also in Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's described that one who takes his birth in the land of Bharatvarsha is very fortunate. Bharate Bhumi Hoile Manusya Janmasar, that it is a rare and fortunate birth to be in this land of Dharma as a human being, to be able to walk the land where Krishna walked, where Lord Chaitanya walked, to be in the place where Krishna conscious culture had been established for millennia. And therefore, Lord Chaitanya said, it is the duty of everyone born in India to spread this Krishna consciousness all over the world. Because of this fortunate birth. What is the use of having some good fortune if we don't share it with others? When Devaki was pregnant with Krishna in the jail cell of Kamsa, the Bhagavatam describes that she was like a fire kept within a pot. She had the Supreme Personality of Godhead in her womb, but she was imprisoned. Or she was also compared to a learned person who does not share their knowledge with the world. There's a brilliant glow, but hidden by the walls of one's own restraint. So what is the use of knowledge without sharing it? As Lord Chaitanya prayed in the first verse of the Shikshastikam, this Sankirtan movement is Vidya Vadhu Jivanam. Vidya means what? Vidya. Knowledge. And what is Vadhu? Anyone know? It means wife, actually. Wife. Wife. Vidya Vadhu. The wife of transcendental knowledge. Why? Because the wife gives life to the husband. Vidya Vadhu Jivanam. The wife and the life of transcendental knowledge. So Sankirtan complements our knowledge of Krishna with life. As Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said, one who has life can preach. So what brings life to the devotee is pleasing Lord Krishna. And Lord Krishna in Kali Yuga is Lord Chaitanya. And what pleases Lord Chaitanya is seeing everybody become happy in this Sankirtan movement. Vidyavadhu Jivanam Anandam Buddhi Vardhanam. The ever-increasing ocean of bliss. This is the Sankirtan movement. So we are challenged to flood these distinctly adharmic countries with this Anandam Buddhi Vardhanam. That is our mission, that is our service to Lord Chaitanya, our service to Srila Prabhupada, our service to Lord Krishna. So how to become absorbed in that service, as Arjuna was tasked to be absorbed in his fight. This is the challenge before us in Krishna Consciousness, in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So I have been a student of this International Society for Krishna Consciousness for nearly 50 years, and seen it go through its various machinations. In the early days of the movement, from I would say 1967 on, there was this phenomenon of young people coming together and finding out a lot of happiness in Srila Prabhupada and his teachings. Nobody thought it could be done. You know? When Srila Prabhupada was asking Sumati Morarji, please give me passage to India, she was teasing him and saying, oh, you just want to go on a tour. You just want to see America. He said, no, this is my mission. This is my instruction from my spiritual master. I must go, and you must give me a ticket. And so she did. But when he arrived, he got off the boat in Boston and looked around, and then he wrote, oh my God, Krishna, why have you brought me here? This place is just in the modes of passion and ignorance. Anyway, you brought me here, so if you wish, you can make my words suitable so that these people can understand the message of Srimad Bhagavatam. I am a puppet in your hands. If you like, make me dance. So in that mood, Srila Prabhupada entered the fray and began with what he had, chanting Srimad Bhagavatam, not knowing if people could appreciate or understand it. So it took a while for Bhagavatam, but the chanting they could appreciate fairly quickly. And they began to think, oh, this is like a new drug, a new way to get high. And that was very appealing to the young people in that environment where Prabhupada was preaching. He didn't go uptown where the rich people were. He went downtown where the poor young people had gathered because the rent was cheap. And in these places, in these neighborhoods, he introduced the chanting. And when a few of the young people caught on, and they began to appreciate not only the chanting but the teachings, then others became drawn in. So until I got to a point where there was a regular congregation. And then they went out and did kirtan in the park, even without Prabhupada. At first he had to take them because they were too scared. But he knew that if they just try it, they would love it, and they did. So they got a big bass drum, the kind you, like marching bands use, and they'd walk around the Lower East Side doing kirtan because there were no madungas around. and people became attracted, including prominent people like Allen Ginsberg and others, influential people who then influenced others. So that was how it began. And the same phenomenon then occurred over and over again, just like Prabhupada sent these young people to other places. First Mukunda and his wife Janaki to San Francisco. They went out for some other purpose, but he said, while you're there, why don't you open a temple? So they did. They got a storefront, and they started chanting, and people started coming. And then Prabhupada came to help and encourage them. And then on to London, where the same thing happened again. These young people, just by chanting, they went to London and succeeded where Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's sannyasis, who had financial support, failed. See, these devotees borrowed $1,000 from Prabhupada to go to England, and you had to be able to have $1,000 to enter, to even get a tourist visa in England. So they went to Amsterdam where it wasn't required, and then one couple, there were three couples. The first couple went over with the $1,000. They went to the immigration, they showed their $1,000, they got in the country, and then they wired the $1,000 back to the next couple. And then they came in and did the same thing. That's how they got in. They couldn't work, they had nowhere to live, they had no contacts, they just went there, and then they had to send the $1,000 back to Prabhupada. So somehow or other, by the potency invested in these devotees, by Srila Prabhupada, they were successful in spreading Krishna consciousness. And that pattern was repeated all over the world. So while they were there, they found that the Indian immigrants, who were numerous in England, were also interested. But Prabhupada said, that's fine, but direct your attention to the local populations. That's where our real mission lies. He said, the Indian people are our natural allies. They will naturally appreciate and join in our Sankirtan. But the other people, you need to reach them. And they're more difficult to reach. Although Prabhupada did say that to bring a Westerner to Krishna consciousness is like waking a sleeping person. To bring an Indian to Krishna consciousness is like waking a person who's pretending to be asleep. It's actually more difficult. But nonetheless, we see that very easily our friends in the Indian community come to our temples all over the Western world. It's interesting that Prabhupada came right when he came in 1965. That was the very year that the American government opened immigration options for people from India. That's why he got that visa so unexpectedly, because the man sent in the application, the sponsorship application, just at the time when the doors were opening up. So, and then he came right at the time when young people from my generation were questioning the values of their parents. The post-World War II generation was a real boom time for America. Like my parents were both from poor families, and they both got to go to college, which was exceptional in their families, and then they established a middle-class life, and they thought, like so many of their generation, how could our children, who are getting what we were deprived of, not appreciate this? But the children were questioning, I'm seeing my parents working so hard and not seeming to have any real meaning or purpose in their work. And the country's engaged in this meaningless war in Vietnam, which is killing so many of our young friends. So what is it all about? It was a time of questioning. And Prabhupada Krishna sent Prabhupada just at that perfect moment. So after Prabhupada's departure, the chaos that ensued, as he describes in the 4th canto, that happens after the departure of the spiritual master, resulted in the dwindling of enthusiasm amongst these young Western devotees. Much of that was a consequence of not being able to properly follow Srila Prabhupada's instructions. But, that's to be expected, the mistakes. It's said that good judgment is the result of experience, and experience is the result of bad judgment. So these devotees made a lot of mistakes, but then we learn from the mistakes, and somehow the movement goes on. Then 50 years is, from a historian's perspective, that's sort of a threshold period. If a religious movement lasts 50 years, it will likely be successful. But they also note that in the course of that evolution, very often the intention of the founder is lost. The intention of the founder becomes obscured, and that we have also experienced. So what happened after the young converts became less able to focus on the mission, not just because of loss of enthusiasm or mistakes by the leaders, but because they were changing ashrams from the renounced single life, simple life, to married life, and they had to get on with their economic development. Most of them had given up their educational years, their earning years, to promote the mission. But coming to the point where they had to marry, then they needed to begin to figure out how to support a family. So as a result, the ministering to the Westerners diminished in the Western temples. By Krishna's grace, the congregations then stepped in. And the congregation stepped in and saved the temples. We didn't lose any of our temples, although many of them were in ICU at different points in the 80s. But the congregations came in. We changed our focus to developing congregational support, and look what happened. Houston is actually a great example, because when we bought this property in 1986, there were about 10 devotees, 10 of us who were living in the temple, young Westerners, and we had a struggle every month to pay the bills and keep the lights on. And wonderful devotees went out and sold these ridiculous Korean paintings door to door. A terrible business, but they sold it. They do it just to bring in enough money to maintain the temple. And then Tamal Krishna Goswami said we should get this property. We were looking at some down in Westheimer, down by Rice University, but this one, he said, no, this is a good one for developing the congregation. And he was so right. So now the congregation has done amazing things. But still the outreach for the Westerners has been weak. And this is the case in many of our temples now, and especially in Western Europe, North America, and Australasia. So we're challenged. How do we reach this community? So it reminds me of the biblical tale of my upbringing, where Jesus goes out to the shore in Galilee, and there are the men fishing, and he says, "Come, follow me, I will make you fishers of men." So if we can imagine for a moment being pescatarians, that's what they call fish in Bengal, they're called sea sabji, right? So commonly eaten. But if you want to go fishing, well, there is one approach is just to take your boat out on the water and hope that some fish will jump in. There's a river in Florida, the Swanee. Thank you. Every year, at a certain time of year, this particular kind of fish, is kind of a carp, I believe, which is a big fish, like weighing 20, 30, 40 pounds. They, as part of their life cycle, they start jumping out of the water like crazy. Have you heard about this? These huge fish go flying out of the water, 3-4 feet out of the water, and there'll be hundreds of them up and down the river, just. And every so often there's an injury or a death, even a death from a boater who's just floating along and gets whacked in the head with one of these flying fish. So that's one approach. You could just have your boat out there, watch your head, and hope that some fish jump in. Another approach is a little more proactive, and let's say you're in your boat and you lean over the side of the boat and you watch down there and try to grab one of the fish coming by, holding very still. And that can also work, but the problem with that is you can only keep your head underwater so long. A few seconds and you have to come up and then try again. So we do these outreach efforts. We make these attempts to go out to the public to try to bring more interest in Krishna consciousness among a wider public. And they're wonderful, beautiful things. The street festivals, the Harinams, even book distribution could be said to be like that in a way. We're out there interacting, and occasionally we can find a person who's so sincere they're ready to step in. But that's rare, and we have to keep our head underwater a long time for that to work. So what do the skilled fishermen do? They put out nets. And they put out nets, and then they sit back in their boat and relax. And then after a while, they go and pull in the net, and if they're fortunate, a few fish are there. So this is the lazy, intelligent way to approach the problem. You know, Prabhupada described these 4 kinds of intelligence. Lazy intelligence is number 1, best kind. Just set things up nicely so that automatically things develop. Second class is the active intelligence, which is sort of the underwater approach. Active intelligence is also good. You'll get some results, but it's a lot more effort. Third class intelligence is lazy foolish. If you're going to do destructive things, at least be lazy about it. And the worst kind is active foolish. You know, I think of certain politicians, but they are, you know, they're doing things and they're very destructive. So lazy intelligent is the most effective approach. The devotees here have done so many amazing things. This incredible temple, wonderful school, all the expansion, the Gauranga Hall, which used to be was a billboard company, right? And we used to look at that building and think, oh my God. The only thing we could think of, I'm glad it's there, it shields the sound of the train a little bit. Haribol. But now it's Gauranga Hall, and then Goswami Academy, and Govinda's Restaurant, and the apartments. It's just amazing for me to come back and see all the development. I feel like Sudama coming back to his hovel, seeing it turn into a palace. But this one area has been tough to find out ways to reach out a broader community. Part of that is a function of the Indian community locally being so enthusiastic about this temple. If Westerners come and they see mostly an ethnic crowd, they think, okay, this is nice, but it's not for me. So how to make it relevant, how to make Krishna consciousness viable? We have to look back to what Prabhupada did in the beginning. What he did was just very simply introduce to chanting and gradually gather a group of young people together around that chanting, around that experience. Rupa Goswami said, Yena tena prakarina mana Krishna naveshayat. Somehow or other think of Krishna, the rules and regulations can come later. Even after his first initiation, Prabhupada initiated 10 or so disciples, and some of them who just happened to show up that evening. And then the next day, one of them asked, Swamiji, now that we're initiated, are there any rules? He said, I'm very glad you are asking that question. So then he posted this famous letter. Okay, initiated devotees are expected to observe these 4 regular principles and chant 16 rounds and attend the temple programs, etc. So it's very instructive for us to understand how Prabhupada did it in the early days. As Iskcon grew, a different kind of mood prevailed. A sort of saffron curtain came over. And because there was so much momentum, you could do that. There was so much momentum that people, like when I moved in, it was like, okay, here's your saffron dhoti, first day. And here's the area on the floor where you sleep. You can have this 6 feet right here. And Mangalarti is at 4:30, and boom, 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 and we'll give you 2 days to decide about shaving your head. But it was so blissful that I said, okay, no problem. Why wait? Do it right now. So that mood kind of prevailed and was prevalent at the time when Srila Prabhupada left this world. People would join very easily. There was great emphasis on renunciation. Don't worry about marriage. Yeah, it's a big mistake if you get married. Just focus on service. And that was all right for this mass of young people who were not really thinking about anything very far in the future. But again, over time, it didn't sustain. In fact, in 1977, you remember, Srila Prabhupada wanted to come back to Gita Nagari. He said, I have established 50% of my mission, book distribution, but the other 50% is Varnashram. And Abhiram Prabhu, who was on Prabhupada's entourage then, said this was because, he told me, this is because Prabhupada was seeing that all these enthusiastic young people were not able to stay in Krishna consciousness. So he wanted to teach them how to go to the farm and live a peaceful life as grihastas, where they could have plenty of time for hearing and chanting and live in Krishna consciousness through their lives. So that part of his mission he did not complete. So again, it's kind of left for us. So the 77 mood, or the intense saffron militaristic mood that was successful then, stopped working not long after Prabhupada's departure. It just stopped working, and people stopped joining, and then everybody kind of looked back as the good old days when the young people used to join. I remember feeling like that, wistfully looking back. Boy, those were sure fun days. And when I was here in Houston and other temples where I was managing, I was trying hard. How can we make more devotees? But they weren't. They just weren't coming very much. So then, 15 years ago, I went to Gainesville, a little temple. Ritadvija Maharaj said, would you please come and run the temple here? They had a lunch program, and there were 2 devotees at the morning program every day, and it was very sleepy. But they did the lunch every day. So we agreed, my wife and I went. We immediately doubled the turnout for the morning program every day, from 2 to 4. And all of us were in our 40s and 50s, and we were dancing around Tulsi one morning, and I was thinking, how are these 50,000 college students ever going to, 3 blocks away, ever going to relate to 50-year-old people dancing around a plant at 5 in the morning? How is this connection ever going to be made? And it was just beyond me to figure out. I really was at a loss. So then, with the inspiration of some wonderful godbrothers, Prithu Prabhu, Hridayananda Maharaj, others, we made a decision, okay, we're going to allocate some space for any newcomers just in case they join. So we made 3 rooms available for newcomers, and amazingly, miraculously, 3 nice students said, all right, we'd like to move in. What would we have to do? And we made an agreement. They'd have to follow the 4 principles, and then they'd have to chant 8 rounds, and they'd have to attend the morning program, but just 5 days a week, not 7. So we made it a little bit easy for them, recognizing their responsibility. Oh, and you'd have to pay some tuition. You have to pay something. Okay, we don't expect any service because you're in school, you're busy. These were all college students. But instead of paying rent elsewhere, you pay tuition to be in our school. We call it the Bhakti Academy. We didn't want to rent those rooms. Rent is a 4-letter word, because when you rent to somebody, then they have no obligation to you, other than to pay the rent, right? So tuition, on the other hand, you're enrolling in a school, then you have responsibilities that you have to maintain to be part of that academic institution. So to our surprise, these 3 students, they started coming in the morning program. They didn't know much, but they dutifully came. And then after a month, something miraculous happened. Something even more miraculous. They started liking it. They started. This is fun. Tell me more about this. Bhakti yoga. And then when they got enthusiastic, other young people started coming and say, "What do you got there?" So tell us about this. So the next semester we made room for 6 and then 12. And the hardest thing for me was not to look surprised when somebody asked about moving in. That was something I had to, because we'd been chasing devotees for so long. Like, please, like, come on, move in. All of a sudden people were saying, "Could I move in?" And we'd say, "Well," like the Army or the Marines, "maybe you can be one of us." So ever since then, we now have about 25 beds for new students, and they're full almost all the time. And we've sent devotees all over the country, because that was something else we realized, that if you're running a school for bhakti, you can't hang on to the students. Just like an academic institution. They come through, they get trained, and then they go on with their lives. Right? So in the same way, a bhakti institution has to be that mood of giving, of service. In fact, this was how it was in the early temples. There was just a reliable flow of devotees. We could count on it, people joining, and then therefore the other devotees could go on and open other centers or go on to other services. It wasn't a big deal, because we knew more people were going to join. But now, when there's very, very few who are coming, especially who have full time to give to the mission, we tend to say, "Oh, no, you got to stay here for the rest of your life. We need you." You see, which may or may not be in the interest of the individual devotee. So the Bhakti Academy in Gainesville has been a wonderful success. It really has been the most fun I've ever had in my years in Krishna consciousness. Just seeing these incredible young devotees coming and then doing so many amazing services, especially for outreach, because it, surprisingly, as wise and as realized as we older devotees are, the young people are actually more interested in other young people. So when young people tell them about Krishna, then they respond. Then they say, "Okay, this could be for me." And this is our realization from the Bhakti Academy in Gainesville. The system that Prabhupada used in the early days, lowering the requirements, demanding less lifelong commitments, just sharing the holy name, just asking people to add Krishna to their lives, that works. And it worked then, and it still works now. We just dialed the clock back a few years, and amazingly, there's still a lot of seekers out there who are looking for Krishna and have no idea that it is Krishna they are looking for. So, Saranga Thakur Prabhu and I spoke about in January, I think, 4 or 5 months ago, and he said, "Yes, we have so many big projects here in Houston. We'd like to have a nice Bhakti Academy." And I said, "Great, I'm ready now." I've retired from the management. One of our students there has taken over and is doing a really good job. So I'd like to see if we can share it in other temples. And then the next 2-3 days later, I got this letter out of the blue from this very nice preacher who said, "I'd really like to do the kind of preaching you're doing in Gainesville. Is there anywhere I could go?" So I said, "Okay, this looks like Krishna is arranging something here." And that devotee is Sadhu Sangha Prabhu, who was here this week visiting. And he's committed, yes, he's going to come back in August and run the Bhakti Academy Houston. So we have a leader, Saranga Thakur Prabhu, and the temple management said, we'll let you use the the urban farm project as your headquarters for this academy, which is a gorgeous and ideal setting. So we're ready to go. But one of the things that we realized in our discussion is that if this project is even remotely as successful as the one in Gainesville is, it's going to impact the Houston community. So the management team asked me to speak a little bit about this, because it is actually a collective effort if it's going to work. Like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. So And by nature, if we're in a nice groove in our lives, we don't like change. But it will take change to make this transition to bringing in a regular flow of young devotees. Indian American, it doesn't really matter where they're from. It's more the youth and the time in life that they're investing in their Krishna conscious training. So what are those changes? Some of those things involve adjusting our cultural practices to accommodate the audience we're trying to reach. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita in Madhya Lila, Prabhupada writes that, and by the way, Chaitanya Charitamrita is, in many respects, this is the mature fruit of Prabhupada's writing. He was writing Srimad Bhagavatam in Vrindavan before there was Iskcon, before he had any disciples except one casual follower. But Chaitanya Charitamrita he wrote when Iskcon was booming, and he now had the experience of coming to the West and finding out the needs and what works in the West. So he wrote that to try to impose the cultural practices of one part of the world on another is niyamagraha. It is trying to do the impossible. Impossible. A word that Prabhupada did not appreciate when Rameshwar used it to describe his proposal to print the entire Chaitanya Charitamrita in 2 months. Impossible. He just blurted out, impossible, to which Prabhupada said, impossible is a word in a fool's dictionary. But Prabhupada himself used the word impossible in Chaitanya Charitamrita to describe trying to impose a whole cultural practice on another culture. So this would impact us in a couple of ways that will be conspicuous. First, one of the cultural values in the West is gender equity. In India, it's a different thing. Gender equity is appreciated, but there's a great tradition of differing gender roles. And why is that? Is because the men historically were responsible. A responsible man can provide a situation where a woman is protected and therefore can devote full attention to conceiving, delivering, and raising children. And that is a very ideal society. But do we have that in the West? No, absolutely not. The men are, by and large, scoundrels, irresponsible. Even the women's liberation movement, Prabhupada called a plot by the men to exploit the women. Yes, you should have equal rights, so you do our jobs, and you have sexual liberation, so we can exploit you all we want, you see. So, because of that, women in the West have a cultural value, I have to take care of myself. And when they hear, oh, you should be submissive to a man, they say, yeah, right. Am I right, Laura? Laura's shaking her head. I'm not debating whether this is right or wrong, but this is the field in which we are trying to reach people. So, as an example of how this project is slated to start just after Janmashtami, and that's when we'd like to implement some of these new cultural practices in the temple. So imagine if you're a young Western woman, and you walk into the temple, and you see here comes the ghee lamp off the altar. So first it goes to all the men, and it goes to the older men first, by the way. First the white Sikhs, then the gray Sikhs, then the brown Sikhs. And then after all the men have honored, then it goes to the women. So what is a woman going to think? Yeah, this place is not for me. So now, before we go any further, let me just ask, do we need women? Because there have been many, many brahmachari ashrams. In Pune and Shalpati, there's these massive brahmachari ashrams with highly educated brahmacharis. To move in the ashram there, you have to have a master's degree and 2 years work experience before you're even allowed to move into the ashram. And they have hundreds of brahmacharis like that. And why do they have that? Because if they change their mind, then they're ready to enter the workforce. See, that's very responsible and thoughtful. In the West, on the other hand, when we've had brahmachari ashrams in many temples, they don't last. They don't last. They're weak because most men are going to become grihastas. And if there are no women who are being trained as devotees, they have no devotee wives to marry. And if there are no women, there's also no sense of balance. They've been their whole lives in coeducational environments, and all of a sudden they're in this single gender environment. It's disorienting. So they're much more comfortable to get involved with a group of young people, men and women. Actually, our ashram in Gainesville is the only supervised women's ashram in the entire continent of North America, out of 60 or more temples. It's the only one that is organized, supervised, and the women who join there, the young women, are just wonderful. They're incredible. They do great service. And because the young women are there, the young men say, oh, I think I'll join too. Prabhupada called the women our secret weapon against Maya. In India, you rarely find ashrams for women. If you do, they're more like convents, a few organizations. But it's very rare, and in Iskcon, non-existent. But in the West, when Prabhupada saw the young women were coming, he sent a letter to all the temples, you should have a brahmacharini ashram. And they're all extinct, they're all gone now. But this is what makes the difference. If the young women join, then the young men join, then there's life, there's growth. And therefore what the young women think is very important. Isn't that right, Srimati Radharani? So the ladies' ashram is a big component of this, and it's critical for our success. So what the young ladies think is important. Therefore, practicing gender equity practices in the temple is very important. Which means that when prasad comes off the altar, it's distributed by where people are located and not by gender. Now, the early temples had this intermixing of gender, so much so that there was no women's side and men's side. Everybody was just packed in together because that's what the Westerners were used to. So having a men's side and a women's side is fine and required and acceptable as long as there's equity. So if the women are in the back and the men are in the front, it doesn't work. If the men push the women back while they're greeting the deity, it doesn't work. So there's got to be some organization in a way that gives equal access to the deities to men and women. Chanting the Bhagavatam verse. What is our routine? We've all seen it our whole devotional lives. Prabhus, okay, now Mataji's. It doesn't work. That second-class citizens, now it's your turn to chant. You see? So anybody can chant. This is the idea. Whoever would like to chant. And when the kids know this coming in, sometimes the boys chant first, sometimes the girls chant first. It doesn't matter. That's what works. That's what brings these young people together and makes them feel like they have a place and they belong. So can you see where these cultural differences are colliding? And so the question before the community now is, are we willing to make the adjustments necessary to accommodate these sort of things? And change the long-established routines in our temple practices to make everybody feel equally at home. So we have the ashram facilities. That's a big part of it. We have an ashram leader. That's a big part of it. Brihat Madunga Prabhu has agreed. A very nice young lady named Amrita has agreed to come and be ashram leaders right off the bat, starting September 1st. And Bhakti Laura has agreed to help counsel all these crazy kids. So, and we have the routines that we've established over 15 years in Gainesville. Radhakrishna Prabhu, our educational director here, has agreed we can adjust the Bhagavatam curriculum to accommodate the needs of newcomers, which will be different than the single verse a day routine that's been going on for decades in all of our temples. We do an overview approach, which is easier for the young people. These and other things are going to be cultural changes that will be confronting us in the community. And we're going to document these things, do more educational things, make sure that the needs are known before they're all suddenly implemented on September, after Janmashtami, basically. But the purpose of this class this morning is just to bring these sort of things up. and ask for the community's support in this endeavor. When the management team and I discussed the idea of a Krishna house in Houston, one of the concerns was that we don't want a separate program. That over there at the farm, there's one thing going on, and the temple is another, and never the twain shall meet. And that's exactly correct from my point of view. We want interaction. So the young students will come over and have class here every day, Guru Puja here every day. And they'll be participating and seeing the deities and letting the deities see them every day. This is an offering to Radha Nila Madhava. So one of the things Radhakrishna Prabhu suggested is that we consider having a daily prayer to the deities. Our dear Shri Radha Nila Madhava, if you send us new devotees, we promise to take care of them. This is the prayer. So what do you think? So, if the community makes this investment, the potential is just so amazing here. It's wonderful here. The farm is a very attractive place for young people to come, and the deities and the temple are just overwhelmingly beautiful and attractive. And the personnel we've got are first-rate people. Krishna has sent people who can take care of these newcomers. The problem is that we are not able to make devotees. How many times have we heard this expression, making devotees? I think of Dr. Frankenstein, who made his human in the lab. He put an arm here and sewed it on and got all these pieces from cadavers, and then he made Frankenstein, So if we could do that, it would give new meaning to the phrase, all glories to the assembled devotees. If we could actually assemble them. But we can't. So we have the facility now to put out a net. It's up to Krishna to send the fish. So that position of being very dependent on Krishna is also a big part of the whole thing. It is not in our power to make them. We are primed and ready to do everything necessary to take care of them, to accommodate them, to feed them, to train them, to engage them, and not to be attached to them like they are now our property. We will be geared to do that. And that's everything that we found in Gainesville was necessary. We had 350 devotees who have come through Gainesville in the last 50 years, newcomers, in the last 15 years. In the previous 10 years, there had been one. So the system has been proven and it works, and we want to try to accelerate your development here as much as possible. But it will impact the community, so that's why we wanted to have this talk this morning. In addition to this talk, of course, there'll be some written information and further chance for dialogue before we try to put new things in place on the 1st. But that's the whole picture. Thank you for listening. I want to take the time to see now if there's any questions or discussion or thoughts about these cultural developments in the community. Okay. Yes, sir?
Hare Krishna. My Bhakti leader has taught me that the only way that a male-embodied jiva can leave a marriage is through taking vanaprast. So, could you please explain that process?
Well, there's no need to leave marriage if one is in a Krishna-conscious marriage. Prabhupada said that. He said, you do not need a pole to preach. So this is a very individual question, and there's no need to, it's really not so pertinent to the young people's needs. What young people need to hear is that it's fine to get married. There are brahmachari books that say if you get married, then your life is ruined. Once you get married, then you're doing 25 to life. But those books are absolute poison for young men, because, and I'm sorry to say with all due respect, because they give a twisted idea of what it means to be a devotee. What it means to be a devotee is just to be yourself for Krishna, to add Krishna to your life, not to try to be something that you are not. Some people will be naturally inclined towards renunciation, that's fine. Most people will be naturally inclined towards grihastha life, and that's fine. So part of our training of new devotees is to help prepare them for grihastha life. And we tell them, don't start relationships. This is a natural thing. We think if there's a men's ashram and women's ashram, they're going to fall in love with each other. Well, they do. That happens. We have a disease called COVID-21. It's called, it stands for Crushes on Vaishnavas in Development. And the way to avoid it is social distancing and masks. But we help prepare the students for these things. Look, you've had so many relationships. These Western kids have generally been through so many relationships. You've had so many. Have they made you happy? How about giving it a rest? Just wait a while, get your spiritual life in order, and then you get married. You can actually be able to sustain a relationship. That's the way we preach to people on that point. See? And that helps reduce the tension. It's amazing that the sexual tension goes down when there is the intergender environment and a brother-sister relationship kind of develops, which is very healthy and attractive. Prabhuji. I don't know if anyone's watching the YouTube to see if there are any chat questions that are coming in.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Comment. This is not intended to step on any senior devotees or anybody, but you're talking about mixing male and female devotees. Within even a single gender like a male, we have a practice of senior has to be in the front when they're taking the darshan or whatever, and the newcomer or some of the even a junior devotee or aspiring to be the devotees, they end up being in the lap in the back, and they don't feel like do I belong in this place? I think that's what you talked about is a wonderful approach, and we should really try that and attract those younger people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a very good point. The whole goal is to allow people to be themselves in Krishna consciousness. Some people will want to be in the front. Some people will want to be in the back. It's just allowing people to be themselves and not feel like you have to fit into a certain role. You have to let all the senior people up. You're just an insignificant junior. Like you say, that isn't a very warming and welcoming message, is it? On the other hand, if you say you have to be in the front because you're a newcomer, that may make some people feel uncomfortable. So educated young people, intelligent young people, they'll figure it out. If the mood is just welcoming and accepting, just be yourself. And we all appreciate you. We love you. We're glad you're here. They feel that. Then they feel like part of the family. Any other questions? I know we've gone over time. I'm sorry. Okay, yes, Prabhuji?
So, welcome back to Houston. Kalakantha.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
So, when you were here last, you gave a class and you said something about if I see a fault in somebody, it can be like a reflection of, or like something that I don't like within myself. So could you please say something about that?
I'd be happy to, but I'd like to see if we could focus on this topic. It's somewhat related to what you're saying, because the young people will certainly make mistakes. And it is important for older devotees to recognize those mistakes. But how to deal with them is the question. So when there's supervision, if you see the new person eating with the left hand, rather than go to that person and say, you should eat with the right hand, rather you tell the ashram leader, please instruct the students, or this new person doesn't understand this etiquette, you see. Then the newcomer can only hear from one person who has a relationship with them, and they feel welcome. If everyone in the community is correcting them, how welcome are they going to feel, you see. So I appreciate that point you're bringing up in that context. Otherwise, we could discuss that philosophical point later and separately, if you'd like.
Light in the mood. I want to share something. I heard a class recently with Hanuman Prasad Swami Maharaj, and you mentioned Jayananda Prabhu. So there was an event like Guru Das Prabhu, Prabhupada's disciple. He was a civil rights leader, helping black people, and there was a big rally somewhere, I think Oakland, California, 2,000, people in a big auditorium, very like militant, and so they were saying, they were saying that my granddaddy was a slave and they were putting him on the ship, and as they put him on the ship, he killed a few of the people. Is that black enough for you, my brothers and sisters?